Chapter 6. May 3rd, 7:15 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Headquarters of the Special Response Team, McLean, Virginia, suburbs of Washington, D.C. "I think I might have something for you," Don Morris said. They were sitting in Don's new office. The place was starting to take shape. There were photos of his wife and kids on the desk, framed ribbons and proclamations on the walls. The desk itself was a wide expanse of gleaming oak. On top of it sat a telephone console, a computer monitor, a cell phone, a satellite phone, and not much else. Don wasn't a big believer in paperwork. "Something to get you out in the field a bit. You've seemed a little antsy since you came here. This might cure that." Luke stared at him. It was almost as if Don had just read his mind. Don had done him a favor by giving him this job. Luke knew that. It was a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. But Luke was already inching toward the door. It had been weeks of sitting and talking so far. Luke was bored. That was okay. The danger was that if it went on too long, he would start to go crazy. Desk-bound intelligence work was not for him. That was beginning to become abundantly clear. "I'm all ears," Luke said. Don gestured back out the open door to his office. "Let's go down the hall." Luke followed Don along the narrow hallway to the brightly lit conference room at the other end. This small office complex had been a satellite office for the Bureau of Housing and Urban Development until 6 months ago. Don was working to drag the building into the 21st century a little bit. With that in mind, a tall young guy with a ponytail and wearing strange wraparound aviator glasses was hanging a flat-panel display on one wall. Another display was already on the far wall, wires running to a control panel on the long conference table. The guy was wearing a red, white, and blue t-shirt, jeans, and red Converse All-Star high-top sneakers. Luke barely looked at him. He assumed that he was a technician from a government contractor agency, or possibly some techie buried deep inside the FBI. "Luke, have you met Mark Swan?" Don said, casually blowing those thoughts out of the water. "He's our new systems designer and operator, in charge of our intelligence networks, internet, satellite connections. Mark's going to wear a lot of hats, at least for a little while. Mark Swan, this is Agent Luke Stone. Luke is our first field agent, although we are about to add a couple more." The guy turned around. He was skinny. He had stovepipe legs. The front of his American flag shirt read, "We're number 31. The guy's eyes met Luke's. Luke sized him up quickly. He was young, maybe early 20s. He looked even younger than that. He was confident, bordering on arrogant. He was smart. He had probably been a computer geek in high school. He and Luke were going to be in different departments. This guy's thing was equipment, taking it apart, putting it back together, making it hum. He had probably never participated in a moment of violence in his life, and might not have witnessed any such moments. They shook hands. "We're number 31, are we?" Luke said. "What are we number 31 at?" The guy shrugged and smiled. "I don't know, man. Maybe you can guess." Luke nearly laughed. "I can't guess," he said. "Maybe you can just help me out a little?" "Healthcare," the guy said. "We're number 31 in healthcare, according to the World Health Organization. We're number 1 in healthcare expenditures, though, if you're looking for something to be proud about." Luke was still holding the guy's hand. "I'd be proud to break a few of your bones and see what a good job American doctors do putting them back together. But you'd probably prefer to get them fixed in Mexico." Swan took his hand back. "Cuba, maybe. Or Canada." "Very nice, Mark," Don said. "I'm sure Agent Stone is glad to discover that he's been risking his neck all these years for a country with such mediocre healthcare performance." Don gestured with his head at the audio-visual setup. "How's it coming?" Mark nodded.
The first display is ready to go. High definition, high-speed connection. You can pull that keyboard up on the table there, and that small screen, and access any of your own files just by using your login. You can choose whatever you want to share, and it'll come up on the big screen. I can easily make that ability available to anyone in the building. I just wanted you to take it for a test drive first, see how you like it.
Don nodded. Very cool. What about visitors? Also, what about sharing information with other venues? The kid, Mark Swan, raised his hands as if to say, "Don't shoot."
It's coming. But we're going to want airtight encryption before we start broadcasting intelligence outside the building. You can email anything you want, but in terms of putting up video imagery or data that appear elsewhere, or bringing broadcasts in here, that'll happen on a case-by-case basis with each partner. CIA, NSA, the White House if it comes to that, even FBI headquarters. They've all got their own procedures, and we're going to be following their leads.
Don nodded. Okay, Mark. I like it already. Can you give Agent Stone and me about 20, maybe 30 minutes, and send Trudy Wellington in here? Swan nodded.
Sure.
When he left, Don looked at Luke. Funny kid, Luke said. Whiz kid, Don said. My goal here is to hire the best. And when it comes to that, it isn't always the guy who fits the suit the best. In terms of technology, usually it isn't. We're cowboys in here, Luke. We're the kids who color outside the lines. That's what they want from us. The FBI director said that himself.
I'm with you, Luke said.
You should be. You're one of the best special operators I've seen in my long career. And in terms of coloring outside the lines, well...
Suddenly, a young woman appeared in the doorway.
If anything, she was even younger than the guy who just left. Don was staffing this place up with children. This child, however, was beautiful. She had long, curly brown hair. She wore a dress shirt and slacks that hugged her curves. She wore big red eyeglasses that gave her a slight owlish appearance.
Don?
Trudy, come in. I want you to meet Luke Stone. He's the man I told you about. Luke, this is Trudy Wellington. She is our new intel officer. She's another whiz kid. Graduated MIT as a teenager. Spent a couple of years in CIA listening stations. Now she's with us, ready to take a quantum leap to the next level of spycraft. Luke shook hands with the young woman. She was a little sheepish. Wouldn't quite meet his eyes. Hell, she was still a kid. Luke glanced back and forth between Don and Trudy. Something about the body language. Nah, it was impossible. Don had been married for 30 years. He had a daughter and a son who were older than this Trudy person. Trudy's going to brief us on the mission we have on deck. Trudy sat right down at the conference table. Luke and Don did the same. She immediately took the keyboard, pulled the small monitor forward, and typed in her information. Her office computer's desktop appeared on the large flat-panel display on the wall. You already know how to use this? Don said.
Yeah, well, we had AV stuff like this at MIT, of course. Not so much at CIA that I saw, but I imagine they have it somewhere. Swan gave me access earlier. I think he was showing off.
Anyway, it's pretty cool, Don said. Luke nodded. He almost laughed again. He pictured steel-eyed Don as he had known him these past several years, parachuting into combat zones, commanding men in the field, remorselessly killing bad guys. He seemed almost absurdly proud of his little agency, its office gizmos, and the young civilians who manipulated them with such ease. Well, good for him. On the screen, a United States Marine Corps ID appeared. It showed a soldier with a flat-top haircut, a broad jaw, and a threatening gaze. He seemed sarcastic, irritated, and ready to murder someone all at once. He looked like the kind of guy who would do his combat service overseas, then come home and spend his time getting in bar fights during R&R. A rough customer. Luke had seen a lot of guys like that. As a matter of fact, he had knocked a few of them unconscious.
I'm going to assume that neither of you have prior knowledge of the subject, or the task at hand, Trudy said. It might make this conversation a little longer than necessary. It might not. But it tends to guarantee we're all on the same page. Sound okay?
Good, Don said.
Sounds okay to me, Luke said. She nodded. Then let's begin. The man on the screen is former Marine Corps Sergeant Edwin Lee Parr, 37 years old, raised in Kentucky, south of Lexington. Combat veteran, who saw action in both the invasion of Panama in 1989 and the Gulf War. He was also deployed in a peacekeeping role at the end of the Kosovo War. Purple Heart and Bronze Star for meritorious service during the invasion of Panama. Honorable discharge December 1999, after 12 years of service. Parr came home and kicked around the country for a year and a half after that, doing security work. He had a concealed carry license and was mostly a personal bodyguard, mostly for businessmen, often for diamond dealers. He worked for a firm called White Knight Security and bounced between New York, Miami, Chicago, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. A few documented trips to Tokyo, Hong Kong, and London, though it isn't clear how the firearm regulations were handled in those cases.
Luke stared into the man's angry eyes. It didn't seem like bad work for a combat veteran. Not much action, but plenty of movement. It might even appeal to a man like...
Then September 11 happened, Trudy said. Did he re-enlist? Luke said. She shook her head. No. Within a short period of time, there was enormous demand for experienced military contractors. White Knight Security spun off a whole new division called White Knight Consultants. Edwin Parr was one of their first available combat zone experts. He did a tour in Afghanistan and has now been in Iraq for 25 straight months.
Luke was beginning to wish he would get to the point. The thought of Edwin Lee Parr in a combat theater, beholden to little or no chain of command, and making 10 times the money of normal soldiers, irritated Luke, to put it mildly. 25 months, Luke said. What's he doing over there? I mean, besides padding his bank account.
Edwin Parr appears to have gone rogue, Trudy said.
She paused and looked away from the keyboard and mouse for a moment.
The next images are graphic.
Luke stared at her. I think we can handle it, Don said. Trudy nodded.
Parr was fired by White Knight 4 months ago, despite having a 5-year relationship with them. White Knight disavows knowledge of his activities or his whereabouts. They disclaim responsibility for his actions.
A new image appeared on the screen. It showed perhaps a dozen bodies strewn about some sort of market square. The bodies were almost not recognizable as human. They had been torn apart by a bomb or some type of high-caliber repeating weapon.
Parr is operating in northwest Iraq, in what is known as the Sunni Triangle, beyond the reach of coalition troops. He has anywhere up to a dozen former or possibly present-tense contractors operating with him, as well as what we believe are 1 or 2 Marine Corps deserters. He is believed to be responsible for ordering a civilian massacre that took place in this Fallujah open-air market, and it is believed this is an image of the aftermath of that massacre. As many as 40 people may have died in the attack.
Luke was interested.
Why would he do that?
A new image appeared on the screen. It showed 2 burned and headless torsos hanging from a bridge overpass.
The bodies you see here have been identified as the remains of former American military contractors Thomas Kalentz, age 31, and Vladimir Garcia, age 39. Their jeep was attacked by Sunni insurgents. They were captured, beheaded, and set on fire. When this happened, neither man was on any payroll as a military contractor. The massacre in the previous image appears to have been payback for the deaths of Kalins and Garcia, as part of an escalating series of tit-for-tat attacks. Kalins and Garcia have been operating with PAR.
What were they doing? Luke said. A new image appeared. A map of the so-called Sunni Triangle.
The Sunni Triangle was Saddam Hussein's stronghold in Iraq. The south of the country is primarily Shiite, and Saddam took great pains to suppress the Shiites, including frequent massacres. The north is primarily Kurdish, and if anything, the Kurds got even worse treatment than the Shiites. But north-central and northwest Iraq is Sunni. Saddam was born there, and the people there are his loyalists. It has been very difficult for the American military to tame this region, and much of it is still a no-go zone. We believe that PAR operates out there because this is where the bulk of Saddam's wealth is hidden. It seems that PAR has been systematically uncovering secret caches of money, weapons, diamonds, gold, and other precious metals, as well as luxury cars. He is finding this stuff through the use of torture and murder of Saddam's former lieutenants, and intimidation of the local population. The locals hate PAR and are actively trying to kill him. But PAR has put together a small army of tough hombres, military consultants, several of them former special operators, and, as I already indicated, possibly 2 Marine Corps deserters. All his men are battle-hardened, and PAR is making them rich, as long as they can stay alive. On that score, they are taking increasingly extreme measures to make sure they do so. Currently, they are kidnapping women and girls from the local tribes. We believe they are holding them as human shields. It's also possible they are selling some of them to Al-Qaeda and to Shiite tribesmen from the south.
Trudy paused.
He is looting Saddam's buried treasure as fast as he can, and he is not letting anyone get in his way.
What's our role in this? Luke said. Don shrugged. We're the FBI, son. We're going to go in there, rescue anyone being held against their will, and arrest Edwin Lee Parr for kidnapping and for murder.
Arrest him, Luke said, for murder, in a war zone, where hundreds of thousands of people have already died.
He let his mind chew on that for a minute. Don nodded. That's correct. Then we're going to bring him back here, try him, and lock him away. This man Parr is a mess, and he needs to be cleaned up. He's a murderer, a liar, and a thief. He's out there beyond anyone's reach, operating under no one's command, and has become a law unto himself. He is committing atrocities that the Iraqi people are blaming on Americans. If he keeps on, he is going to cause an international incident, one that will give our entire effort in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and around the world a black eye.
Luke took a deep breath. How do you picture this going?
Don and Trudy stared at him. Trudy spoke.
If you take the case, the CIA will provide you with an identity as a corrupt military contractor on the make, she said. You and a partner will proceed alone to the Sunni Triangle, find Parr's headquarters from 6 suspected locations, infiltrate his team, arrest him, and then call for a helicopter extraction.
Luke grunted. He nearly laughed. He looked at young, lovely Trudy, graduate of an elite East Coast university. For some reason, he focused on her hands. They were tiny, immaculate, even beautiful. He doubted they had ever held a gun. They looked like they had never lifted anything heavier than a pencil, or been sullied by an ounce of dirt in their lives. Her hands should be on a commercial for Palmolive. Her hands should have their own TV show.
"That sounds good," he said. "Did you come up with that?" "I can tell you that my last helicopter extraction went pretty well. My best friend died. My commanding officer died. Pretty much everybody died, actually. The only people who didn't die were me, a guy who lost his mind, and another guy who lost both his legs and his mind, and, his ability to—" Luke trailed off. He didn't want to finish that sentence. "That guy won't speak to me anymore, because he asked me to kill him, and I declined." Trudy stared at Luke with those big, pretty eyes. The glasses made her eyes seem bigger than they really were. She looked at this moment like a scientist staring through a microscope at an insect. "That's awkward," she said. "It's old news," Don said. "You either climb back on the horse, or you don't." Luke nodded. He raised his hands. "I know. I'm sorry. I know that, okay? So, let's say I go in. What if Parr doesn't want to come quietly? What if spending the rest of his life in prison doesn't exactly appeal to him?" Don shrugged. "If he resists arrest, then you terminate his command, and terminate his group's ability to operate by whatever means available to you at that time." "You realize we're talking about Americans?" Luke said. They both just looked at him. Neither one answered. A long moment passed. It was a silly question. Of course they realized. "Do you want it?" Don said. It took a minute before Luke spoke. Did he want it? Of course he wanted it. What choice did he have? What else was he going to do? Sit in this office building and go crazy? Sit here and turn down missions until Don finally got the message and let him go? This was what he had been hired for. Compared to the things he had done previously, it wasn't even much of a mission. It was practically a weekend getaway. An image of Rebecca, very pregnant now, out at her family's cabin, flashed across the screen in his mind. His son was growing inside her. He would be here soon. Despite this desk job, despite the long commute, despite the fact that he was gone all day 5 days a week, the past month was about the happiest they had ever been together. What was Becca going to think about this? "Luke?" Don said. Luke nodded. "Yeah, I want it." Chapter 7, 6:15 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Queen Anne's County, Maryland. Eastern shore of Chesapeake Bay. "You look beautiful," Luke said. He had just arrived. He had ripped off his shirt and tie and changed into jeans and a t-shirt as soon as he walked in the door. Now he had a can of beer in his hand. The beer was ice cold and delicious. The traffic was insane. It was a 90-minute drive from D.C., through Annapolis, across the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, and onto the eastern shore. But none of that mattered, because he was home now. He and Becca were staying at her family's cabin in Queen Anne's County. The cabin was an ancient, rustic place, sitting on a small bluff right above the bay. It was 2 floors, wooden everything, with creaks and squeaks everywhere you stepped. There was a screened-in porch facing the water, and a kitchen door that slammed shut with enthusiasm. The living room furniture was generations old. The beds were old metal skeletons on springs. The bed in the master bedroom was almost long enough, but not quite, for Luke to sleep comfortably on it. By far the sturdiest thing in the house was the stone fireplace in the living room. It was almost as if the grand old fireplace had been there already, and someone with a sense of humor had built a clapboard shack all around it. To hear tell of it, the house had been in the family for 100 years.
Some of Becca's earliest memories happened in that house. It really was a beautiful place. Luke loved it there. They were sitting on the back patio, enjoying the late afternoon, as the sun slowly went west over the vast sweep of water. It was a breezy day, and white sails were everywhere out there. Luke almost wished that time would stop, and he could just sit right in this spot forever. The setting was amazing, and Becca did look beautiful. Luke wasn't lying about that. She was pretty as ever, and almost as petite. Their son was a basketball she was smuggling under her shirt. She had spent part of the afternoon digging a bit in her garden, and she was a little bit sweaty and flushed. She wore a big, floppy sun hat and was drinking a big glass of ice water. She smiled. "You don't look too bad yourself." A long pause drew out between them. "How did your day go?" she said. Luke took another sip of his beer. He believed that when trouble was brewing, the thing to do was to get right to it. Beating around the bush was not normally his style, and Becca deserved to hear it right away. "Well, it was different. Don is staffing the place up, and he dropped the project in my lap today." "Well, that's good," Becca said. "It's good news, right? Something to sink your teeth into? I know you've been feeling a little bored by the job and frustrated by the commute." Luke nodded. "Sure, it's good. It could be. It's police work, I guess you'd say. We're the FBI, right? That's what we do. The downside is, if I'm going to take the assignment, and really I don't have a lot of choice since it is my job, then I need to go out of town for a few days." Luke could hear himself hemming and hawing. He didn't like the sound of it. Go out of town? Was it a joke? Don wasn't sending him to Pittsburgh. Now Becca sipped her water. Her eyes watched him over the top of the glass. They were wary eyes. "Where do you have to go?" Here it came. Might as well put it out there. "Iraq." Her shoulders slumped. "Oh, Luke, come on," she sighed heavily. "He wants you to go to Iraq? You just came from Afghanistan, and you nearly got killed. Doesn't he realize we're about to have a baby? I mean, he knows this, right?" Luke nodded. "He saw you, babe. Remember? He brought you down to see me." "Then how can he even think of this? I hope you told him no." Luke took another sip of his beer. It was a touch warmer now, not quite as delicious as a moment ago. "Luke, you told him no, right?" "Sweetheart, it's my job. There aren't a lot of jobs like this available to me. Don threw me a rope and saved my neck. The Army was going to say I had PTSD and put me out on my butt. That didn't happen because of Don. I don't have a lot of room to tell him no right now. And, as things go, this is a pretty easy assignment." "An easy assignment in a war zone?" Becca said. "What's the job? Assassinate Osama bin Laden?" Luke shook his head. "No." "What is it then?" "There's an American military contractor over there that's out of control. He's looting old Saddam Hussein hideouts and stealing cash, artwork, gold, diamonds. They want me and a partner to arrest him. It's not a military operation at all. It's a police job." "Who's the partner?" she said. He could see in her eyes she was thinking about what happened to his last partner. "I haven't met him yet." "Why don't they just have the military police do this?" Luke shook his head. "It's not an issue for the military. Like I said, it's a police matter.
The contractor is technically a civilian. They want to make the difference clear.
Luke thought of all the things he was leaving out. The restive nature of the region, and the fierce fighting going on there. The atrocities Parr had committed. The team of badass operators and remorseless killers he had accumulated around himself. The desperation they must feel right now to get out alive, unscathed, with all their loot, and without being captured by the law. The dead men, decapitated and burned, and hanging from a bridge. Abruptly, Becca started crying. Luke put the beer down and went to her. He kneeled by her chair and hugged her.
Oh, God, Luke, tell me this isn't going to start up again. I don't think I can bear it. Our son is coming. I know, he said. I know that. It's not going to be like before. It's not a deployment. I'll be gone 3 days, maybe 4. I arrest a guy, I bring him home. What if you die? She said. I'm not going to die. I'm going to be very careful. I probably won't even have to draw my gun.
He almost couldn't believe the things he was telling her. She was shaking now from the tears.
I don't want you to go, she said. I know, honey, I know, but I have to. It'll be very quick. I will call you every night. You can stay with your folks, and then I'll be right back. It'll be like I never even left.
She shook her head, the tears coming harder now.
Please, she said, please tell me it's going to be okay.
Luke squeezed her tight, mindful of the baby growing inside her.
It's going to be okay. It's going to be fine. I know it is.
Chapter 8, May 5th, 3:45 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Joint Base Andrews, Prince George's County, Maryland. You're the boss, Don said. He was a couple of inches taller than Luke, and quite a bit broader. With Don's gray hair and his size and his age and his experience, well, Luke always felt a little bit like a child next to Don. Don't let them forget who's in charge. I'd be coming with you, but I'm stuck in meetings. You're my representative. As far as this trip is concerned, you are me. Luke nodded.
Okay, Don.
They were walking a long, wide corridor through the terminal. Swarms of people, mostly in uniforms of various kinds, milled about, moving to and fro. People were standing and eating at Taco Bell and Subway. Men and women were hugging. Piles of baggage were going by on carts. The place was busy. There were 2 wars on at once, and all across the armed services, personnel were on the move. We've got a new guy joining you. He's your partner, but you're the senior partner. His name is Ed Newsom. I like him. He's big, he's cocky as hell, and he's young. I plucked him out of Delta, even though he's only been there a year.
A year? Don?
In a year, he's already acquitted himself very admirably. Believe me, you're going to be happy I acquired this guy. He's a stud. He's an animal, like you were at that age. At 32, Luke was already beginning to feel old. He had been back in the gym the past few weeks, and it was suddenly an uphill climb to get in shape. That was a rude awakening. He had let himself go during his stay in the hospital. Trudy and Swan are traveling with you, but they won't go into theater with you. They will stay in the green zone where it's safe and offer you guidance and intelligence from there. Under no circumstances should you put them in harm's way. They are not military personnel, nor have they been. Luke nodded. Understood. Don stopped. He turned to face Luke. His hard eyes softened a touch. It was like he was Luke's dad, the father he never had. Don was just a big, gray-haired, broad-chested, faced like a granite cliff dad. You're going to do fine, son. You've held command positions before. You've been in war zones before. You've been on difficult missions before. Impossible missions. This isn't like that. This one's got a glass jaw, okay? Big Daddy Cronin is going to be running this operation on the ground. He's got your back, and he's going to make sure you have the people you need in the air above you and one step behind you. Luke was glad to hear that. Bill Cronin was a CIA special agent. He had been around the block a few times, had a lot of Middle East experience. Luke had served under him twice before, once while on loan from Delta Force to the CIA, and once during a joint special op. Don went on. I fully expect you guys to walk in there and for Parr to drop his weapon and throw his hands in the air. He'll be relieved you're not Al-Qaeda. We need an early win to show the congressman we mean business. So I padded your comeback schedule with an easy knockout. But don't tell the others that. They think this is the most serious thing ever. Luke smiled and shook his head. Okay, Dad. I'd ruffle your hair, but you're too old, Don said. Up ahead was a small waiting area for their gate. 3 rows of 5 seats each were clustered in front of a desk, and behind the desk, the door to the tarmac. The desk was abandoned, and no one sat in the chairs. This was an empty area of the terminal. Through the large windows, Luke could see a small blue State Department jet plane parked and waiting outside. A rollaway staircase led up to the open cabin door of the plane. A group of 3 people milled around at the gate. 2 of them were Trudy Wellington and Mark Swan. Trudy was tiny and looked every inch of it. Swan was tall and thin, but was positively dwarfed by the 3rd member of their party, a black guy in jeans and a leather jacket. The black guy stood by himself, a little bit away from Trudy and Swan. He had a green rucksack on the floor at his feet. That the guy? Luke said. Newsom? Don nodded. That's the guy. Luke soaked him in as they approached. He looked to be 6 foot 5 inches tall. His shoulders were broad, as was his chest. Beneath his leather jacket he wore a white t-shirt that clung to his massive frame. It looked like someone had painted it on there. His arms were covered by his jacket, but his fists were huge. He wore yellow work boots on his big feet. He looked like a cartoon rendering of a superhero. Except for his face, it was as arrogant and as young as that of any kid in high school. There wasn't a line on it. This guy has seen combat before? Luke said. Don nodded again. Oh, yeah. Okay. You're the boss. Yes, I am. They reached the group. The 3 of them turned. Trudy's and Swan's eyes were focused on Don, their boss. The newcomer, Newsom, looked at Luke. Thanks for coming out, everyone. Trudy and Mark, you've had the opportunity to meet Luke Stone, your commander on this trip. Luke was one of the best special operators I had the pleasure to serve with in the United States Army. Luke, this is Ed Newsom, who I didn't serve with, but who I've heard spectacular things about. The 2 men shook hands. Luke looked into the eyes of the larger man. Newsom didn't do anything overt. He didn't, for example, try to crush Luke's hand in his own. But his eye said it all. You don't command me. Luke begged to differ. But this wasn't the time or the place to worry about it. If they were going to work together, though, especially in a combat zone, the time would almost certainly come. Don said a few words of encouragement to send the group off, but Luke wasn't listening anymore. He just watched those hard young eyes as they watched him.
Chapter 9. 11:15 p.m. Central European Summer Time. 5:15 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Institut Le Rosé, Rolle, Switzerland. It was the most famous school in the world. Well, it was the most expensive anyway.
But really, it was just very boring, and she didn't want to be here. Her mom and dad had sent her here for a year of finishing before she went to college, and it had been the dreariest, loneliest year of her life. Maybe things would get better now that it was almost over. She was accepted to Yale for the fall. Of course she was. Her father was one of Yale's most well-known alumni, so why wouldn't they accept her? She was Elizabeth Barrett, younger daughter of David P. Barrett, the current President of the United States. In fact, she was finishing up on the telephone with her dad right now. "Well, sweetheart, are there any positives you can take away from this year?" That was her father, always talking about positives. Was it even a real word? He said words and phrases like that all the time. There were always positives and takeaways, and we were always moving forward and climbing the ladder and building something great. She had begun to suspect that he wasn't nearly as optimistic as he talked. The whole act was a fake, a fraud. He just said these things because he knew that in his life there was always someone listening. She hated that part of it. She hated the security detail from the Secret Service that hovered nearby 24 hours a day. She liked some of the agents themselves, but she hated the fact of it, that it was necessary, that her life was stilted and thwarted at every turn because of it. They were listening to this phone call, of course, and they were never far away. A man stood out in the hall all night while she slept. "I don't know, Dad," she said. "I just don't know. I'll be glad to get out of here." "Well, you got to go skiing in the Swiss Alps, right? You met people from all over the world." "I liked our Colorado trips better when I was a kid," she said. "And the people I met? Yeah, great. Kids from Russia, whose dads are the gangsters who stole all the industries when the Soviet Union collapsed. Kids from Saudi Arabia and Dubai, whose dads were all princes or whatever. Is everybody in Saudi Arabia a prince? I think that's the big takeaway, Dad. Everybody in Saudi Arabia belongs to the royal family." Her dad, the president, laughed. It made her smile. She hadn't heard that from him in a long, long while. And it made her think about how things used to be, back when her dad worked in the family oil business and co-owned a pro football team. He had been a fun dad, once upon a time. When they used to have family barbecues, he would wear a chef's apron that said, "World's Funnest Dad" on it. That seemed like a long time ago now. "Well, honey," he said, "I'm pretty sure not everybody in Saudi Arabia is in the royal family." "I know," she said. "Some people are servants and slaves." "Elizabeth," he said, but he wasn't angry. He was having fun with her. She was always the one to say the outrageous things, even when she was young. "The truth hurts, Dad." "Elizabeth, that's very funny, but I've got to run. Do this for me, will you? You've got just a week left to go there. Try to make the best of it. Take advantage of the opportunities presented, and do something that excites you, okay?" "I don't know what that would be, Dad," she said. Except now she was lying to him. "But I'll do my best." "Good. You're beautiful, hon. Your mom and I love you. Grandpa and Grandma send their love. And call your sister, will you?" "Okay," she said. "I love you too, Dad." She hung up the telephone. In her mind, she imagined all the people who were hanging up at the same time. Her dad, certainly, probably in the Oval Office, but also Secret Service people listening on other phones at the Oval Office, 2 or 3 of them hanging up as one. Also, people sitting at computer screens in the CIA building or the FBI headquarters. Also, her personal bodyguard standing out in the hall with a wire going to his ear. Was he on the phone call? She bet he was. Also, the Russian and Chinese spy agencies. You knew they were listening. And the billionaire Russian gangsters who sent their uncouth lout children to this expensive school. Were they listening? Probably. Also, the security office here at the school. Of course they were listening. Providing security was a big part of the babysitting service here. And the school advertised to parents about how seamlessly the school's security apparatus can dovetail with your own to safeguard every moment of your child's learning experience. She felt like screaming. She sat for a moment on her bed. Outside the window, it was night in Switzerland. She could see the lights of boats on Lake Geneva from here, and the darkness of the mountains towering on the other side of the lake. She could even see the twinkling lights of villages high on the hillsides. For a moment, she looked at herself in the full-length mirror across from her bed. She was pretty. She knew that. She had long brown hair and a very nice body, even if she had to say so herself. But she was 18 years old, and she had barely even kissed a boy in her life. No boy could get through the security cordon around her. She was bored. She was trapped. She was going to die a virgin. She could not believe that this was her life. She couldn't say a word without people listening in. She couldn't go anywhere without large men following her, encircling her, protecting her. And really, she couldn't go anywhere at all. Every place she wanted to go was a security risk. Well, she would see about that, wouldn't she? She got up and walked through her apartment to the bathroom that she shared with her suite mate. She crossed through the room with its heated tile floors, its rain shower, and 5-foot wide vanity and mirror. It was a nice bathroom, she had to admit. Her family was old money. They didn't believe in luxurious things, and she had never had a bathroom like this one before. She knocked on the adjoining door.
"Come in,"
a voice said. Elizabeth opened the door and entered. Suddenly, she was in another world, the apartment of Rita Chadwick. The apartments were the same generic layout, bedroom, small kitchen, and living area, but Rita had personalized hers. She had a sense of bohemian hippie culture, and the place was hung with drapes and beads and Tibetan prayer flags. On one wall was a giant poster called Earthrise, showing planet Earth as it supposedly looked from the moon. On another was a life-sized poster of the rapper Eminem on stage, wearing a t-shirt and dripping sweat. Rita wore bell-bottom jeans and a flowered shirt. She was darkly pretty and had straight black hair tied back with a purple head wrap. Allowing Elizabeth to have a suite mate was the one nod to normalcy that her dad, the Secret Service, and the school would give her. Even that was hardly normal. Elizabeth and Rita were suite mates and friends, but they led very different lives. Rita's family had owned magazines and newspapers for 2 centuries. She had wealth, but no security to speak of. Her family was fine with the level of security provided by the school. It was nothing for Rita to hire a car service to take her the 20 miles into Geneva on weekend nights. She would eat in the restaurants and party in the dance clubs until the early hours of the morning, then take a car back here, arriving home around dawn. Or sometimes not at all. Sometimes on weekend nights, after participating in whatever lame group activities were on offer here on campus, Elizabeth would wake up in the early hours before sunrise and listen to see if Rita had come home that night. Rita had freedom, and lots of it, and Elizabeth had none. The Secret Service had vetted Rita and found her not to be a threat, mostly because there was no way to smuggle anyone on campus. People she knew in Geneva could visit her, but only during the daytime, and they couldn't come into the building at all. After they passed through security, they had to sit out on the campus grounds. Rita was sitting on her bed, making a drawing on a pad with a thick black pencil.
"Hey, babe,"
she said, without looking up.
"Hey, babe,"
Elizabeth said. Hey, babe. That was their thing. They called each other babe. Elizabeth's friendship with Rita was one of the few good things that had come out of the school year. Rita was going to Brown next year in Providence, Rhode Island, just up the road from Yale. Elizabeth was hopeful that they would stay in touch and stay friends. But you never could tell. A lot of these so-called friendships fell apart after you weren't in the same space anymore.
"How's your dad?"
Rita said.
"You know,"
Elizabeth said. Rita nodded.
"I know. He's president, and that's a big job." "That's right."
Rita flipped the page in her drawing pad. Now she was writing something instead of drawing.
"I imagine he's busy doing presidential things." "He's very busy acting presidential," Elizabeth said.
It was dummy talk. Over time, they had evolved a system of communication that the Secret Service couldn't overhear or intercept. They would continue to talk normally about this or that, like dizzy high school girls. All the while, they would pass written messages back and forth, which they would later rip up and throw out in the dining hall garbage cans. Rita turned the pad around and showed Elizabeth what she had written.
"Do you still want to go for it? Escape mode?"
Escape mode was a plan that Rita had invented for Elizabeth. A way to break her out of the prison she was in and give her a chance to experience a little adventure, a little excitement, and what little nightlife the city of Geneva had to offer. The plan was daring, to say the least. Breathtaking, audacious. If it worked, it would only work once. So any attempt at it was a one-time chance, a desperate grab for all the marbles. Their rooms were 2 stories above the ground, but their windows opened to a rooftop that sloped downward to the edge. According to Rita, there was a rain gutter out there made of a hard metal, like steel or iron. It was not flimsy. She knew this because she had climbed down it on a couple of occasions during the middle of the night to visit a boy in one of the other dorms. Escape mode involved Rita preparing to go to Geneva on a weekend night. Meanwhile, Elizabeth would pretend to turn in early, while also preparing for a night out. Rita would call for a car service to pick her up. When the car came, Rita would go downstairs like she always did. Elizabeth would sit inside with the TV set on, loud. Elizabeth had been watching the TV with the sound way up for months, on the off chance she would ever get the guts to try escape mode. With the TV on, Elizabeth would then slide out the window she had opened earlier, cross the roof silently, shimmy down the rain gutter, drop to the ground, then run for the driveway turnaround where the car would be parked. Once she was inside the car, they would head for the gates of the school. The car's windows would be blacked, and according to Rita, security on the way out of campus was cursory, a wave-through compared to how it was on the way in. If they made it through the gates, for once in her life, Elizabeth would be free. Rita would take her to Club Baroque, where the dance music DJs played, and they would dance to house music in a packed nightclub until the place closed. Then they would go for food and coffee, and get back here at dawn. It was the crime of the century. There were boys who lived in Geneva, their families were in banking, whom Rita hung out with. Sometimes they came to campus during visiting hours. One of them was a very handsome young guy from Turkey named Ahmet. He was thin, with curly black hair, and skin the shade of coffee. Light and sweet, Rita called it. He wore American-style clothes. He spoke English. He was normal. Not like a lot of Arab guys who were religious fanatics. Were Turkish guys Arabs? Elizabeth wasn't sure about that. But Rita had told Elizabeth that Ahmet thought she was cute. Rita handed Elizabeth the pencil. She tapped the words, "Escape mode?" Elizabeth made a quick scrawl in response. "Yes." "Well, you know," Rita said, "when you're leader of the free world, you have a lot to worry about. Wars going on everywhere. Fingers on the button. Yuri's dad cutting off natural gas supplies to Europe." Yuri was an idiotic 14-year-old boy from Moscow who went to school here, and who delighted in telling anyone who would listen that his father controlled the natural gas pipeline running from Russia to Germany. Yuri hadn't gotten his growth spurt yet. He wasn't even 5 feet tall. Elizabeth handed the pencil back.
"That's all Yuri has, natural gas," she said. "Clock's ticking," Rita wrote. "School year's over. Friday night?" "And he blows it up everybody's ass," Rita said.
Elizabeth took the pencil and circled the original yes.
"Sure?" Rita wrote.
Elizabeth circled the word again. Now it was yes, in 2 big black circles. They both laughed at poor little Yuri. Silly boy.
"Good," Rita wrote. "It'll be fun."
Elizabeth nodded.
"Fun," she said.
It was a weird thing to say, since it didn't quite follow what Rita had said. But it was all Elizabeth could think of. Fun. And that was all it was to Rita, who took her vast freedom for granted. Her nights in Geneva, her occasional side trips to London and Paris and Milan. But to Elizabeth, it was something else again. It was huge. It was energizing. It was terrifying. Her entire body tingled when she thought about it. Her breath caught in her throat. Would she be able to go through with it? Would she be able to make herself climb through the window and shimmy down the rain gutter? Then what? A drive through the countryside to the city. A crowded club with lights flaring, music pumping, bodies pressed together. Drinks? Sure. She would have a drink, even though she was technically too young. Just a long, hoped-for night of adventure. The chance to be anonymous among anonymous people, and maybe have some real fun for once. Well, her dad told her to do something exciting, didn't he? Who was she kidding? Her parents would kill her if they found out, and they were definitely going to find out. Escape mode only went in one direction. There was no plan for coming back in. There was no way to shimmy back up the rain gutter. She would just have to re-enter the campus and the building the old-fashioned way. By then, the Secret Service man outside her door would have probably grown suspicious of the TV playing all night and let himself in. The alarm would be raised. There might even be an international incident. Elizabeth felt herself ramping up with anxiety. She took a deep breath to try to calm herself down. After this, she was going to be grounded until she was 40. Rita wrote something new. She turned it around so Elizabeth could see. "Ahmet will be there,"